Let's dive into it. We'll look at 6 research papers covering oral systemic health and genetics and genomics published in 2025 and explore what they reveal about how oral health affects our overall well-being and vice versa. First up, we're going to discuss genetics, specifically how genes affect oral health, but not just any genes related to the oral microbiome. Check out this study from 2024, Genetics Causal Analysis of Oral Microbiome on Type 2 Diabetes in East Asian Populations, Bidirectional to Sample Mendelian Randomization Study. Okay, let's break this down. First off, it's a Mendelian randomization study, which is awesome. It's a study design that helps us figure out if there's a causal relationship between things, in this case, oral microbes and type 2 diabetes. Instead of looking at observational data where people self-report what they eat, MR studies use genetic variants as natural experiments because genes are like nature's way of doing a randomized controlled trial. It's super cool. So in this study, they looked at genetic variants that are connected to the abundance of certain types of bacteria in the mouth. They wanted to find out if having certain types of oral bacteria is actually causing type 2 diabetes. Now, this is important because we know that type 2 diabetes is a metabolic condition where your body struggles to control blood sugar levels, but we still want to understand the mechanisms behind it. The study focused on East Asian populations, which is great because it looks at a specific group of people to see if there are unique oral bacteria associated with diabetes. And guess what they found? Yep, 3 oral bacterial genera, Aggregatibacter, Polyngentia, and Prevotella, were found to be causally linked to an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. On the flip side, they also identified for genera Granulicatella, Haemophilus D, Corynebacterium, and Capnocytophaga that appeared to have a protective effect against type 2 diabetes. Pretty cool, right? Now, this isn't the whole picture. We still need to learn more about exactly how these bacteria cause diabetes. Are they producing some kind of toxin that raises your blood sugar levels? Or is it more complicated than that? Regardless, this study gives us a new perspective on the link between oral health and diabetes. It shows that it's not just about brushing and flossing, but there might be a connection at the genetic level too. Okay, next up, let's talk about oral dysbiosis as a risk factor for systemic conditions. It's a game changer in the world of oral systemic health. This editorial in Frontiers in Oral Health titled Exploring Oral Microbiota Dysbiosis as a Risk Factor for Non-Communicable Diseases gives us a broader picture of how oral health is linked to overall health. The article explores the role of dysbiosis, which is basically when the balance of bacteria in your mouth gets thrown off. They dive into how this dysbiosis can increase the risk of chronic diseases like cardiovascular diseases, respiratory diseases, cancer, and even neurodegenerative diseases. It covers a lot of ground and cites several studies to back up its claims. One of the interesting parts is a Mendelian randomization study led by he and colleagues. It's another genetic study where researchers explored the relationship between oral microbiota and respiratory infections. It's fascinating to see how genetics plays a big role in understanding oral systemic health. As always, remember to stay critical. Just because something is published in Frontiers doesn't mean it's not valid. Frontiers is a bit controversial since anyone can publish there and pay to have their work accepted, so be cautious. But this editorial does provide a good overview of the field and highlights the importance of considering the oral microbiome when studying systemic diseases. Maybe one day we'll be able to treat diseases in the mouth as a window into overall health. Who knows? But it's definitely food for thought. Next, we'll talk about oral microbiome signatures as genomic biomarkers for cancer prognosis. Let's check out this study published in Oral Microbiome Signature predicts prognosis of colorectal carcinoma. What does all this mean? Well, it's pretty straightforward. This research found that the mix of bacteria in people's mouths can be a good indicator of how colorectal cancer might turn out. Basically, they took samples from people with colorectal cancer and compared the types of bacteria in their mouths to how the cancer progressed. And what they found was that certain types of bacteria were more common in people whose cancer seemed to be progressing more aggressively. It's like having a sixth sense for cancer, except it's your mouth bacteria doing the sensing. So why is this important? Well, being able to tell how a cancer might progress just by looking at someone's mouth bacteria could be a game changer. It could mean that we could develop new ways to monitor cancer and predict outcomes without having to do invasive procedures. But there are still some questions we need to answer. For example, this study focused on people with colorectal cancer. Can the same thing be said for other types of cancers? Also, we still need to learn how exactly the mouth bacteria influence cancer progression. Is it through the toxins they produce, or are they triggering our immune system in some way? More research is needed to understand the underlying mechanisms, but nonetheless, it's a promising start, and I'm excited to see where this research goes in the future. All right, let's talk about the oral-brain axis. How is your mouth connected to your brain? Sounds weird, but it's a real thing. There is a growing body of evidence that links what is happening in your mouth to what is happening in your brain, and a recent study from 2025 sheds some light on this connection. It is called Linking Oral Microbiome to Brain Health via 16 seconds RNA sequencing and topological data analysis. The study explored how the bacteria in your mouth might be linked to your brain health. They collected data from the Hamburg City Health Study, which included a bunch of participants aged 40 and older. Through this study, researchers got tons of information on each participant's brain health, including cognitive tests, brain imaging, and blood samples to measure inflammation. What did they find? Well, they identified specific types of oral bacteria that were more common in people with certain brain health issues. For instance, they found that higher levels of a type of bacteria called Parvomonas micra were linked to lower cognitive test scores. That means people with more of this bacteria had worse brain function. They also found that certain types of bacteria were linked to changes in brain structure and function, as well as higher levels of inflammation in the blood. So how does this work? How do mouth bacteria affect your brain? The exact mechanisms aren't clear yet, but researchers think that maybe they trigger inflammation in the body, which can affect the brain, or perhaps they release chemicals that travel from the mouth to the brain and directly affect its function. Either way, it's clear that there's a connection between the two. Now, this isn't just a one-off study. Other research has also linked oral bacteria to things like Alzheimer's disease and dementia. It's like there's a whole hidden world in your mouth that's influencing your brain health. And while there's still a lot we don't understand, it's a fascinating area of research that I'm excited to see develop further. Okay, let's talk about intracranial aneurysms. These are basically ballooning of the blood vessels in the brain that can be life-threatening if they rupture, and research suggests that oral bacteria might play a role in their development. This study from 2024 called Oral Microbiome Dysbiosis and Intracranial Aneurysm Association Study investigated whether there are specific types of bacteria in the mouth that are more common in people who have intracranial aneurysms. To do this, researchers recruited 60 people who had intracranial aneurysms and compared them to a control group of 60 healthy individuals. They collected saliva samples from everyone and analyzed the types of bacteria present. What they found was that people with intracranial aneurysms had different types and amounts of bacteria in their mouths compared to healthy individuals. Specifically, they found that people with the condition had higher levels of certain types of bacteria such as Eubacterium, Rothia, Gymella, Streptococcus, Lactobacillus, and Bacteroides, while other types of bacteria were less abundant. This is intriguing because it suggests that there might be a link between the bacteria in your mouth and your risk of developing intracranial aneurysms. Of course, correlation doesn't equal causation. More research is needed to understand if these bacteria are contributing to the development of intracranial aneurysms or if they are just along for the ride. But it's a fascinating area to explore nonetheless. Maybe one day we'll be able to identify people at risk of developing intracranial aneurysms by simply analyzing their oral bacteria. Who knows? Lastly, we'll dive into population reference standard for oral microbiome variation. This 2025 study, Oral Microbiome Profile of the U.S. Population, is an amazing resource. Why? Because it provides baseline data on the oral microbiome for people living in the United States. It's like creating a snapshot of the typical oral bacteria found in the U.S. population. The research team collected saliva samples from over 15